The late afternoon sun cast its golden rays across the peaceful suburban neighborhood, transforming each house into a picturesque vision of suburban bliss. Shazaib sat in his cozy living room, a large mug of hot tea cradled in his hands as he flipped through the pages of a book. It had been a long day, but as the sun began to dip behind the horizon, the quiet stillness of his surroundings offered him a rare moment of solace. His new home, a modest two-story house with a well-maintained lawn, had been the perfect retreat after a long day at work. Moving here from the bustling city had been a decision he had thought long and hard about, but it had been the right choice. The suburban charm of the area was exactly what he needed. For Shazaib, the move wasn't just about escaping the chaos of city life. It was an opportunity to start fresh. And in this quiet, seemingly perfect neighborhood, he had been hired to work on something that would change the way people thought about safety, the neighborhood security system. His background in tech and engineering had led him to this job. He had spent weeks designing the perfect surveillance system, making sure no corner of the neighborhood was left unmonitored, from cameras hidden in the trees to motion sensors installed. Under bushes, his work was invisible to the untrained eye, but it was everywhere. Every house, every driveway, and even every mailbox was now under the watchful eyes of his creation. Shazaib had enjoyed the project at first, pleased by the challenge it presented. However, there was a growing sense of unease. He had always been an introvert, preferring to keep to himself rather than engage in small talk with neighbors. He wasn't exactly a people person, but the reality of living in a neighborhood where everyone knew each other's business was proving to be a little more challenging than he had expected. Despite his best efforts to keep a low profile, people in the neighborhood seemed to always be watching, always looking for something interesting to gossip about. That in itself was a bit unsettling. But the more time he spent here, the more Shazaib realized that the quiet charm of the suburb came with its own peculiarities. Among the neighbors was Karen, the ever-watchful HOA officer who had an almost obsessive interest in the goings-on of the community. With her short, clipped haircut and a rigid sense of propriety, Karen had established herself as the unofficial enforcer of rules. She was the type who noticed every minor infraction, whether it was a mailbox slightly askew or a lawnmower left out in the rain. But today, Karen's attention had turned toward something new. She had been curious about Shazaib's backyard for weeks. Rumors had circulated in the neighborhood that Shazaib, being the quiet and mysterious person he was, might be hiding something back there. It wasn't the first time she had eyed his property, but this time, her curiosity had reached a fever pitch. The object of Karen's obsession had been Shazaib's newly installed privacy fence. A few weeks ago, he had put up a high, solid wooden fence around his backyard, hoping to create a private space where he could relax without being constantly observed. It was an elegant design, simple but effective, offering both seclusion and protection from prying eyes. But to Karen, this fence was a challenge. It was a barrier to her ability to see what was happening inside Shazaib's yard, and it irked her. On that particular evening, Shazaib had no idea what was unfolding outside. He was far too absorbed in his book to notice anything amiss. Karen, however, had already decided that the only way to solve the mystery of what Shazaib was hiding was to get a closer look. Armed with nothing more than a ladder and a pair of binoculars, she approached his house under the guise of a casual evening walk. She glanced around, making sure no one was watching, before carefully setting the ladder up against the fence. With determination, she began to climb. As she ascended, her heart raced with a mix of excitement and a tinge of guilt. She knew this wasn't something she should be doing, but her curiosity outweighed her better judgment. Shazaib's security system, however, had other plans. From the moment Karen had crossed onto his property, the hidden cameras positioned throughout the yard had activated. The sensors tracked her every move, sending real-time notifications to Shazaib's phone. He was aware of her presence now, but he decided to let her continue, curious to see just how far she would go. Little did Karen know she was being watched, and every motion she made was being recorded in crystal-clear detail. Karen reached the top of the ladder and peered over the fence, her face lighting up with the satisfaction of having gotten a glimpse into Shazib's private world. Her eyes scanned the yard below, searching for anything that might explain the mystery of Shazib's life. But just as she was leaning forward to get a better view, disaster struck. The ladder, which was positioned precariously on the uneven ground, gave a violent wobble. Karen's balance faltered, and before she could regain her composure, the inevitable happened. With a loud crash, she tumbled off the ladder, landing awkwardly on the soft grass below. Shazib's eyes widened. In surprise, as he rushed to the window, he had heard the thud, and when he saw Karen lying in his yard in a heap of twisted limbs and scattered clothes, he couldn't help but stifle a laugh. There was Karen, the self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood's rules, now sprawled on, the ground having just made a fool of herself in the most dramatic way possible. For a moment, he debated whether he should rush outside to help or let her deal with the consequences of her actions on her own. But before he could make a decision, Karen slowly began to rise, brushing herself off and trying to act as though nothing had happened. She looked around nervously, clearly embarrassed by the scene she had just caused. Shazib stood there for a moment, his hand resting on the doorframe, a quiet smirk playing at the corners of his lips. This wasn't how he had expected the day to unfold, but he couldn't deny that it was entertaining. What was even more amusing was the fact that Karen had no idea that she had been under surveillance the entire time. She had been so focused on getting a peek into his yard that she had completely forgotten about the system he had put in place to protect the privacy of everyone in the neighborhood. Shazib watched as Karen tried to regain her composure, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. He couldn't resist the opportunity to have a little fun with her. With a calm, measured voice, he called out, "Need some help, Karen?" The HOA officer froze, her face going pale. She knew then that Shazib had seen everything. There was no hiding it now. And, as she turned to face him, she was struck by the realization that the very system she had so carelessly tried to breach had been designed by the very person she had so often judged. It was a moment of reckoning that she hadn't anticipated, and it was one she wouldn't soon forget. The commotion outside had caught Shazib off guard. He had heard the loud crash and the subsequent rustling, and as he made his way toward the window, he couldn't help but feel a sense of amusement. The sight that greeted him was undeniably entertaining. Karen, sprawled on the ground in his yard, struggling to get up, brushing off dirt and grass from her clothes. For a moment, Shazib wondered if he should intervene, if he should rush outside to help her. He wasn't heartless after all, but at the same time, he was conflicted. The very woman who had constantly monitored the neighborhood, poking her nose into everyone's business, was now the one in a rather ridiculous situation. As Karen finally gathered herself up from the ground, she seemed to be trying her best to act casual, even though it was clear from her flushed face and trembling hands that she was anything but. There was no mistaking it. She was embarrassed. Shazib, however, felt no sympathy. His eyes lingered on her for a moment, his mind replaying the events that had just unfolded. Karen had been spying on his property, a clear violation of privacy, and had gotten herself into this awkward position all because of her nosy behavior. At first, Shazib considered pretending he hadn't seen anything, just closing the curtains and going about his day as if it had never happened. But something inside him decided otherwise. Maybe it was the injustice of her intrusion into his private space. Maybe it was the fact that she had spent so much time scrutinizing his every move. Or perhaps it was simply the humor of the situation. Whatever it was, he couldn't help but stroll outside to confront her. As he walked toward her, his arms crossed over his chest, his face split into a bemused smile. Shahzaib's mind wandered to the countless times Karen had made snide comments about his quiet demeanor, about how she had assumed he was hiding something. In truth, Shahzaib had always kept to himself. He enjoyed the solitude, the peace of his own company, and while he had occasionally greeted neighbors or exchanged pleasantries, he had never been one for long-winded conversations. He had found comfort in the privacy his home afforded him, and he had hoped that the carefully designed fence would give him even more of that. But here was Karen, attempting to invade that very privacy, thinking she could peer over the fence without consequences. Karen looked up as Shahzaib approached, clearly flustered. Her attempts to maintain composure fell flat. She straightened herself up as best as she could, but her movements were stiff, as though her body was still in shock from the fall. Her face was bright red, her eyes darting around, trying to make the situation appear less awkward than it was. I was just checking on something," she stammered, her voice strained as if she hoped that some explanation would smooth over the embarrassment. "It's nothing, really." Shahzaib raised an eyebrow. "Checking on something, huh?" His tone was casual, but there was a slight edge to it that made it clear he wasn't buying her excuse. He knew what she had been doing. After all, his security system had captured every single moment, from the moment Karen had climbed the ladder to the precarious position she had placed it in, to her fall and even her brief moments of surveying his yard. All of it had been documented. The cameras had captured everything in precise detail. His gaze met hers, and for a fleeting moment, he saw the panic in her eyes. Karen wasn't used to being caught off guard. She was always the one in control, the one overseeing the rules. But in this instance, it was clear she had underestimated Shahzaib and his ability to protect his privacy. He had designed the system with utmost care, and it had done its job well. Shahzaib couldn't resist the opportunity to add a bit of sarcasm to the situation. "Well," he continued with a wry smile, "you might want to be careful next time." He gestured toward the ladder, still lying on the ground. "I designed the security system for this whole neighborhood, you know." For a moment, Karen just stood there, her mouth slightly open, as if trying to comprehend the full weight of Shahzaib's words. Then it hit her, like a wave crashing over her. The very person she had judged, the one she had constantly found fault with for being distant and mysterious, was the one who had designed the very system she had just tried to bypass. The irony of the situation was almost too much for her to process. Her face paled slightly as she stammered, You designed it?" Shahzaib nodded slowly, savoring the moment. "Yes, I did," he said calmly. "And the funny thing is, while you were spying on my yard, you didn't realize you were being watched the entire time. I'm afraid your little operation has been thoroughly documented." Karen's expression morphed from surprise to confusion and then to something closer, to realization. She had never suspected that Shahzaib, the quiet neighbor she had silently criticized, was the one who had constructed the entire security network that ensured her privacy, and the privacy of everyone in the neighborhood. It was an uncomfortable truth, one that made her feel both foolish and humbled. She had assumed Shahzaib was just some private man who didn't want to mingle with the rest of the neighborhood, that perhaps he had something to hide. But the reality was quite the opposite. Shahzaib had designed the security system not just for his own protection, but for everyone's. He had invested time and effort into making sure that the neighborhood was safe and that everyone's privacy was respected, including Karen's. For a long moment, the two of them stood there in silence, the awkwardness of the situation hanging in the air. Shahzaib's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with Karen's sudden flustered state. She had always prided herself on being the one who kept an eye on the neighborhood, but in this moment, it was clear she had lost her position of control. She had been outwitted by the very system she had so arrogantly assumed she could bypass. I had no idea, Karen finally said, her voice softer now. I didn't mean to, well, to intrude like that. Shazib couldn't help but smile at her apology, but he didn't let her off the hook too easily. I understand that you were just doing your job, he replied. But perhaps next time, you should remember that privacy is something everyone values, even those who may seem a little more reclusive. His words were firm, but not unkind. He wasn't out for revenge. He simply wanted to make sure she understood the value of respecting others' boundaries. Karen nodded, her eyes downcast. You're right, she murmured. I didn't think it through. The realization had hit her hard, but it was clear that it was a turning point for both of them. Karen, the ever-vigilant HOA officer, had learned a valuable lesson in humility. Shazib, for his part, had proven that he wasn't just the quiet, mysterious neighbor. He was someone who valued privacy and security, not just for himself, but for everyone around him. As Shazib turned to head back into his house, Karen called out, her voice tinged with a new respect. Shazib, I'll be more careful from now on. I didn't mean any harm, but I can see now that I've overstepped. Shazib paused for a moment, his back to her. He glanced over his shoulder, offering her a small but genuine smile. It's all right. Just remember, next time you're curious about someone's backyard, maybe knock on the door first. Karen smiled awkwardly, nodding her head in agreement. As Shazib walked back into his home, he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Not only had he protected his privacy, but he had also given Karen a lesson she wouldn't soon forget. And for the first time since moving in, Shazib felt a little more at ease in the neighborhood. Perhaps, after all, it wasn't so bad being the person who designed the system that kept them all safe. The days following Karen's fall were filled with a peculiar mix of awkwardness and quiet amusement for Shazib. As the incident became the talk of the neighborhood, a strange kind of energy swept through the community. At first, there were hushed whispers, followed by curious glances whenever Shazib crossed paths with anyone. By the time the gossip had fully spread, the entire block was aware of Karen's rather embarrassing fall from the ladder, and more importantly, the circumstances surrounding it. Shazib, ever the quiet observer, had decided to have a bit of fun with the situation. He had recorded the entire incident on his security system cameras, and with a devilish grin, shared the footage with a few close neighbors, carefully editing out the part where Karen had been spying on his backyard. The footage, though harmless, quickly became a neighborhood sensation. People couldn't help but chuckle at the sight of Karen, the self-important HOA officer, in her moment of defeat. They had always found her judgmental and overly strict, but this time, her failure had put her in an entirely new light. Karen, who had prided herself on controlling the neighborhood with her rules and watchful eyes, had unwittingly become the subject of neighborhood jokes. It wasn't long before she became something of a local legend, not for her efforts to maintain order, but for her dramatic fall, quite literally from the heights of her self-assuredness. Shazib, for his part, had a mix of satisfaction and mild amusement. He never intended to embarrass her further, but he couldn't help but enjoy the irony of the situation. After all, Karen had been the one to criticize his quiet, reserved lifestyle, and yet, here she was, caught in a clumsy and almost slapstick moment. But as the days passed, Shazib noticed something else. The neighborhood seemed a little more relaxed, a little more connected. People were talking to each other more openly, finding humor in something that had initially seemed like an awkward incident. There was a shared sense of camaraderie now, built not on the neighborhood rules Karen had so staunchly enforced, but on a more human connection, one born out of shared laughter and the realization that sometimes life had a way of humbling even the most self-assured individuals. As for Karen, the situation weighed heavily on her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling of embarrassment that clung to her like a shadow. She had prided herself on being the watchful guardian of the neighborhood, always keeping an eye on things, making sure everyone followed the rules. But now she had been caught in the act of violating the very privacy she was supposed to protect. Her attempt to spy on Shahzaib's backyard had been nothing short of a personal failure. She had been so focused on judging him, on labeling him as the quiet, mysterious neighbor hiding something, that she had failed to see the bigger picture. Shahzaib wasn't the problem. In fact, he was the one who had made sure the neighborhood was safe, secure, and, most importantly, respected. It wasn't just the fall that had humbled her. It was the realization that Shahzaib, the very person she had thought was hiding behind his fence, was the one responsible for the safety and privacy she had always taken for granted. The quiet man had designed the security system that protected the entire neighborhood, making sure everyone's boundaries were respected, and yet she had violated those boundaries in the worst possible way. Karen's introspection was slow at first, but it grew over time. The more she thought about the situation, the more she realized how wrong she had been in her judgment of Shahzaib. She had been so quick to assume that his reclusiveness meant there was something he was hiding, something suspicious about him. But in truth, he was just a man who valued his privacy and had worked hard to ensure the safety of others. His silence wasn't a cover for some dark secret. It was simply his way of living his life in peace. It took Karen a few days to fully digest this newfound understanding, but when she did, she knew that it had to change the way she viewed both Shahzaib and the people in the neighborhood. One evening, a few days after the incident, Karen found herself standing outside Shahzaib's door. She had been grappling with her own emotions for hours, rehearsing what she would say. She knew she had to apologize. It wasn't just about the fall. It was about the deeper realization that she had disrespected his privacy and had been judgmental, without understanding the full picture. She took a deep breath, adjusted her clothes, and knocked on the door. When Shahzaib answered, he greeted her with the same calm demeanor that had defined him since the day they first met. His eyes were soft, but there was a slight knowing smile playing at the corners of his lips. He had expected this visit. He had known that Karen, after the initial shock of the incident wore off, would come to realize the lesson he had unintentionally taught her. "Shahzaib," Karen began, her voice unsteady. She took a deep breath before continuing. I wanted to apologize for what happened, for the spying, for making assumptions about you. I should have respected your privacy, and I shouldn't have judged you based on things I didn't understand." Shahzaib looked at her for a moment. His expression unchanged, but his eyes softened with genuine understanding. "It's all right, Karen. Everyone makes mistakes. The important thing is that you realize it and you're willing to make it right." He paused, his gaze steady. "Privacy is something everyone values, including me. I just wanted to make sure that everyone here, even you, felt safe and respected." Karen nodded, her gaze dropping to the ground. She was embarrassed, but there was also a sense of relief in finally owning up to her actions. "I've learned that the hard way," she said quietly. "I never realized just how much work you put into this neighborhood. I thought I was just following the rules, but I failed to see the bigger picture." She looked up at him, her face sincere. "You've done a lot for this community, Shahzaib, and I respect that." Shahzaib gave a small, understanding smile. "Thank you, Karen. I appreciate that." He paused for a moment, then added with a light-hearted tone, "And if you ever need help with the security system, don't hesitate to ask." Karen laughed softly, the tension between them easing. "I'll keep that in mind," she replied, her voice warmer now. She turned to leave, but then stopped and turned back to face him. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything, and I'm sorry, truly." Shahzaib nodded once more, his smile genuine. "No need to thank me. Just remember, respect goes both ways. From that day on, Karen became a much quieter presence in the neighborhood. The once watchful HOA officer no longer pried into the lives of others. She had learned the value of privacy, of boundaries, and of respecting the space that each individual needed. The awkwardness that had once hung between her and Shazaib had dissipated, replaced with a newfound mutual respect. While their interactions were still brief and polite, there was an unspoken understanding that would remain between them. Shazaib, on the other hand, returned to his peaceful existence, his days once again flowing smoothly, without interference or unnecessary drama. His design had not only protected his own privacy, but had also helped teach a valuable lesson to a neighbor who had, at one point, thought she knew better. It had been a strange twist of fate. Karen had tried to intrude into his life, and in the process, she had learned something that changed her perspective on both Shazaib and her own role in the neighborhood. From that day forward, Karen never attempted to peek into anyone's yard again. She had learned that some things were better left unseen, and sometimes the quietest people had the most profound wisdom to share. And so, life returned to normal in the neighborhood. Shazaib continued to quietly tend to his private world, his system keeping everyone safe, while Karen kept her watchful eyes to herself. The balance of peace and privacy that had once been disrupted had now been restored, and both of them understood the true value of respecting the boundaries of others. Don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned for more unbelievable stories like this, only on the HOA Stories.